There's a moment they don't talk about enough. Not the breakup, not the argument, not the final words. It's the silence after you stop reacting. That's the moment everything shifts. Because when a narcissistic dynamic loses its emotional fuel, what follows isn't calm, it's a sequence. A predictable escalation that looks like panic. Because in a sense, it is. And there are 5 stages to it. Have you ever noticed what happens when you stop explaining yourself? Stop defending? Stop emotionally engaging? Suddenly, the intensity increases, not decreases. Messages change, tone shifts, behavior escalates. It's almost as if your withdrawal becomes more powerful than anything you ever said while still engaging. That shift isn't random. It follows a pattern. At the first stage, disorientation, what often gets misread as sudden emotional chaos is actually a disruption in expectation. In a narcissistic dynamic, there is usually an unspoken internal model of how the other person will respond, how quickly they will engage, how intensely they will react, and how reliably they will return to the cycle of attention, conflict, or reassurance. When that predictable pattern breaks, especially when someone stops reacting altogether, it creates an immediate gap in that internal map. The response is not genuine curiosity about the other person's well-being, but an urgent attempt to restore predictability. This is why you may see seemingly contradictory behavior in this phase. There can be a sudden softening of tone, as if nothing happened, followed quickly by probing messages, indirect check-ins, or attempts to reopen emotional access points. It can look like confusion, but it is more about recalibration than reflection. The mind is essentially asking, what input still works, rather than what has changed in the relationship. There is often a noticeable inability to settle on one strategy because the usual emotional triggers are no longer producing the expected response. This stage can also feel unsettling for the person stepping back because the shift is immediate and disproportionate. But what is actually happening is not deep emotional insight or transformation. It is the system trying to reestablish control through testing, repetition, and variation of contact until something elicits the familiar reaction again. Because without that reaction, the dynamic no longer functions in the way it used to. In the second stage, escalation of control attempts, the underlying pattern shifts from uncertainty into active pressure. Once simple re-engagement tactics fail, there is often a noticeable increase in intensity designed to pull the other person back into emotional responsiveness. This is where communication may become more frequent, more urgent, or more emotionally charged. Messages that once carried a casual tone can suddenly feel loaded with significance, insistence, or implied consequences. The purpose is not mutual understanding, but reinstating the old rhythm where emotional responses were predictable and immediate. What makes this stage particularly confusing is the alternating quality of the behavior. There can be moments of apparent warmth or nostalgia, followed by urgency or frustration. This inconsistency is not accidental. It functions as a form of pressure. Positive emotional cues are used to lower defenses, while urgency or guilt is used to override boundaries. The underlying strategy is to create enough emotional activation that disengagement becomes harder to maintain. There is also a tendency to increase proximity-seeking behavior in indirect ways, such as checking through third parties, revisiting shared memories, or finding reasons to reinsert themselves into daily awareness. Even seemingly practical communication can carry an emotional undertone designed to reopen engagement. The intensity often rises not because of deeper connection, but because the lack of response is being interpreted as a loss of influence, which the system attempts to correct quickly. For the person who has already stepped back, this stage can feel like being pulled into a stronger current just as they are trying to reach still water, because every increased attempt is calibrated around restoring reaction rather than respecting absence. In the third stage, rage and devaluation, the emotional tone often shifts sharply once previous attempts to regain control fail. What may have started as confusion and then intensified outreach can now turn into frustration that is directed outward. This is not a grounded anger rooted in genuine emotional processing, but a defensive reaction to the loss of influence. When expected responses are consistently withheld, the absence itself can be experienced as a threat to psychological stability within the dynamic. At this point, communication may become colder, more critical, or dismissive. There can be sudden rewriting of past interactions, where earlier closeness is minimized or reframed in a negative light. The purpose of this shift is not accuracy, but restoration of internal balance. By devaluing the other person, the emotional weight of their withdrawal is reduced, at least on the surface. It becomes easier to tolerate loss if the person losing their attention is redefined as less significant or flawed. What makes this stage particularly destabilizing for the recipient is the contrast. The same source that previously intensified attempts to reconnect may now appear detached or even hostile. This reversal can create emotional confusion, especially if there is residual attachment or expectation of consistency. The intensity of criticism or dismissal often rises in proportion to the inability to re-establish engagement, which is why it can feel disproportionate to the situation. Underneath the surface, this stage is still reactive rather than resolved. The devaluation is not a settled conclusion, but a temporary psychological strategy to manage discomfort. It allows the system to maintain a sense of control by redefining the narrative when actual control through emotional engagement is no longer available. In the fourth stage, replacement or performance, the focus shifts outward as the internal system tries to stabilize itself by creating new sources of attention or validation. When direct emotional engagement no longer produces results, there is often a visible pivot toward alternative connections, new environments, or curated social displays that suggest movement and independence. On the surface, this can look like rapid recovery or emotional detachment, but it is more accurately a reorientation of attention rather than genuine processing of loss. This stage is often characterized by heightened visibility of new interactions or interests, sometimes amplified in ways that feel intentional. Social presentation becomes more significant, as if there is an audience that needs to be convinced that nothing essential has been lost. The goal is not necessarily the depth of new connections, but the signaling function they serve. They communicate replaceability, resilience, or indifference, even when the internal state may not align with that presentation. There is also a performative quality in how this shift unfolds. Past narratives may be reframed to emphasize autonomy or superiority, while the previous connection is minimized or compartmentalized. This allows the emotional discomfort of loss to be redirected into a story of control and forward motion. At the same time, new attention sources can be used as tools to provoke awareness or reaction from the person who has disengaged, maintaining a thread of indirect connection even without direct contact. For the person who has stepped away, this stage can be misleading because it often appears as closure from the outside. However, it is less about resolution and more about substitution of attention structures, where external validation temporarily fills the gap left by withdrawal without addressing the underlying dependence on emotional response. If you've recognized even part of this pattern, pause and reflect on something important. You don't have to explain your withdrawal for it to be valid. Sometimes the most powerful boundary is not a confrontation, but consistency in non-engagement. If this resonates, take a moment to consider, where are you still emotionally available in a dynamic you've already mentally left? In the fifth stage, emotional collapse beneath the surface, the outward intensity often fades, but what follows is not true resolution. Instead, there is a quieter form of instability where the system no longer receives consistent emotional feedback to regulate itself. Without that external response loop, the internal structure that relied on attention, reaction, or engagement becomes less organized, leading to inconsistency in behavior rather than dramatic expression. This stage can look like withdrawal, sporadic contact, or periods of silence interrupted by sudden attempts to reconnect. The key feature is unpredictability. Unlike earlier stages where strategies were more clearly directed, here the attempts may appear fragmented or less coordinated. There may still be efforts to regain engagement, but they are often weaker, less sustained, or mixed with hesitation. The energy that once drove escalation is now uneven because the reinforcing response is no longer reliably present. Internally, this can feel like loss of orientation within the relational dynamic. The previous structure depended on clear cause and effect, where certain behaviors reliably produced emotional reactions. When that system stops working, there is no immediate replacement framework, which creates a kind of functional void. That void does not always translate into visible emotional breakdown, but it can manifest as restlessness, reattempts at contact, or shifting between detachment and re-engagement without stability. For the person who has disengaged, this stage often brings the most clarity because the emotional noise has reduced. However, it can also carry the lingering pressure of intermittent reappearance, which can test consistency in boundaries. What defines this stage is not emotional healing, but the gradual loss of structured influence over the other person, leaving behind a pattern that is no longer coherent enough to maintain its earlier intensity or direction. There isn't an official sixth stage in the framework outlined earlier, so adding a numbered step beyond that would be misleading. What often gets referred to as a next phase, though, is a lingering pattern of intermittent re-engagement that can follow after the main cycle has already destabilized. It doesn't function like the earlier stages with clear escalation. Instead, it appears as scattered attempts that come and go without consistency. In this phase, communication may resurface unexpectedly after periods of silence, often without acknowledgement of what happened before. These reappearances can feel confusing because they may not carry the same emotional intensity as earlier stages. Instead, they can be brief, casual, or framed around practical reasons, nostalgia, or low-level emotional cues. The purpose is still tied to testing whether the previous connection can be reactivated, but the approach is less structured and more opportunistic. What makes this pattern distinct is its unpredictability. There is no sustained effort to rebuild or resolve. Rather, there are isolated moments of contact that seem disconnected from one another. This can create a push-pull effect for the person who has disengaged, especially if they interpret the reduced intensity as change or growth. In reality, it is often a continuation of earlier dynamics, but with diminished energy and less coherence. This phase can also involve indirect forms of contact, such as observing from a distance or reappearing through social channels without direct communication. The underlying mechanism remains the same: checking whether emotional access still exists. However, because the earlier structured cycle has already broken down, what remains is fragmented and inconsistent, reflecting not resolution, but the absence of a stable relational framework that previously depended on predictable emotional response. Like point 6, there isn't an official seventh stage in the model discussed earlier, so it wouldn't be accurate to present this as a separate structured phase. What people often describe at this point is actually the long-term outcome of consistent emotional withdrawal, the fading of reinforcement loops that once sustained the dynamic. Over time, when emotional engagement is no longer available, the system that relied on it loses efficiency. Early reactions like escalation, anger, performance, and intermittent reappearance gradually lose intensity because they are no longer being met with the response that originally gave them meaning. What remains is often reduced effort, shorter contact attempts, or complete disengagement, depending on the individual and the context. From the outside, this can look like calm or acceptance, but internally, it is more about adaptation than emotional processing. Without consistent feedback, there is no stable structure to maintain the previous cycle, so behavior becomes less directed and more situational. Some individuals may shift focus entirely elsewhere, while others may still intermittently test for reactivation of old patterns, but without the earlier intensity or persistence. For the person who has stepped away, this stage is often where clarity becomes most stable, because the emotional volatility that previously defined the interaction is no longer present. However, the key thing to understand is that this is not necessarily transformation in a deep emotional sense. It is the natural weakening of a feedback-driven dynamic when the feedback is no longer supplied. What once depended on reaction gradually dissolves into inconsistency, then into absence, not because of resolution, but because the system that sustained it can no longer operate in the same way. Point 8, in this context, refers to the final internal shift in the person who has been disengaging. The moment when emotional availability no longer defines their behavior in the dynamic. It is not a dramatic event or a single realization, but a gradual internal consolidation where the need to explain, justify, or emotionally respond to the other person's reactions diminishes significantly. Earlier stages of withdrawal often still carry traces of engagement, where silence might feel strategic, but still emotionally charged. Over time, that charge reduces as the nervous system stops treating the dynamic as something requiring ongoing management. What changes here is not just behavior, but the meaning assigned to it. Instead of disengagement being something reactive, it becomes simply the default state. The other person's escalation, silence, or reappearance no longer dictates internal emotional shifts in the same way. This is important because it breaks the original loop, which depended on predictable emotional responsiveness to sustain itself. Without that responsiveness, the dynamic loses its leverage. This stage also involves a stabilization of boundaries, where consistency matters more than intensity. There is less internal negotiation about whether to respond or re-engage, because the decision framework has already been established through repeated experience. Importantly, this is not about emotional detachment in the sense of numbness, but about reduced reactivity. The emotional system is no longer being repeatedly activated by external attempts to pull it back into the cycle. From a broader perspective, this is where true disengagement becomes self-sustaining. The absence of reaction is no longer effortful. It is maintained by clarity rather than struggle. The dynamic loses its central position in the person's emotional landscape, not because it is forgotten, but because it no longer organizes their responses or attention in any meaningful way. In the end, what often gets described as panic is really the collapse of a system that depended on emotional response to stay stable. When that response is no longer available, the patterns that once looked powerful begin to lose coherence. What follows is not a single emotional truth, but a series of adaptive shifts, attempts to regain what no longer functions in the same way. But the most important shift is not on their side. It is on the side of the person who stops participating in the cycle. Because disengagement is not just silence. It is a change in how emotional energy is allocated. It is the point where reaction is no longer automatic, where explanation is no longer necessary, and where presence is no longer offered to dynamics that require constant emotional labor to sustain themselves. And over time, that consistency becomes the real boundary, not the intensity of a final conversation, not the clarity of a single decision, but the repeated absence of re-entry into what no longer serves emotional stability. That is what ultimately changes the structure of the interaction. So what looks like chaos from the outside is often just the breakdown of predictability. And what looks like distance from within is often the return of clarity.